This is a video interview of Joseph Martin, a member of American Legion Post 265 on Anderson Island. And here is Joe describing his military service in his own words.
My name's Joe Martin. I first came out to Anderson Island in about 2002 on a bicycling date with my wife, and we wound up buying a house out here in 2004, and we've only been living here full time since I retired from the Navy in March of 2019. So long service history. My father was actually stationed at Fort Lewis in World War II before going overseas, and I have a great uncle who was served in the Navy in World War I as a corpsman, served with Marines. And I have a father-in-law who's a retired Navy pilot, and then I came into the military after high school. I joined the Army. I was a military policeman. Got out, and I had a police career down in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I gravitated back because of my involvement in the youth program with the Navy. When I was in high school, I wanted to be involved in law enforcement and the sea services, so I went to Coast Guard Reserve for a couple of years, but there wasn't much pay for an E5, and it was always the weekend that I was missing something with the family or the kids, so I got completely out and waited many years, finished college on my own, and then I attended a luncheon where a Navy recruiter was talking about Navy Reserve Officer programs, so I thought, well, that sounds good, I'll apply for that. And the Navy recruiter said, it's going to take about a year to get you in. So if you just go down and join the National Guard, since you were in the Army before, you'll start earning points. So I did that in June of 2001, and I had barely joined a unit when 9/11 happened. And I didn't know they could mobilize you that quickly. I was instantly back on active duty, came up to Fort Lewis, met my wife, and then came off active duty for a few months, and was mobilized again, sent to Iraq. Came back, and I was able to pursue a commissioning program in the Army Reserve, so I switched from the National Guard to the Army Reserve. And then I was on active duty for the Army, and I was sitting there one day and thought, I started this whole thing again because I was trying to get in the Navy, and I applied for and was able to switch over to the Navy Reserve, where I finished out my career. I retired from law enforcement, came back on active duty, and I had some great assignments. I loved the Navy. I never got to go to sea for more than a few days at a time, but I did work for a couple of really interesting places. The Military Commissions Defense Organization, which I was an investigator for them, and they defend the people that are in Guantanamo Bay, so people are probably never going to get out anyway. And then my last job was with the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that was a lot of fun, very, very interesting job. I can't talk much about the specifics of it, but it was a little bit like being in a James Bond or an Austin Power movie, depending on what day it is. That's kind of my military service. Probably the most memorable things that happened to me were being in Iraq as an older person, because I didn't go into a combat zone until I was in my 40s. And so it's very surreal when you're surrounded by, that when you go from a training environment to a real thing. And that was, I don't know how to describe that other than to say it's, when you're used to seeing tanks and planes and parades or in training environments, and then all of a sudden you realize that the shape that's being fired by an aircraft, or the way they're maneuvering, or when a tank goes by you, and you go, wow, I'm really here, and this is really going on. Or, when people start shooting or mortaring you, you're like, wow, it's just, you just have a different, I guess, I'm not sure what I would have thought when I was 20, but it was certainly odd to be in my 40s and be in that environment.
What did you do in Iraq?
I was a military policeman at that time. During my enlisted service, I was a military policeman, and or in the Coast Guard, I was a port security man, which is essentially the similar job. And then when I came back, when I was commissioned, I was a transportation officer, so I was trained in transportation logistics, and I worked on active duty doing that a little bit, moving units from the United States to Afghanistan and Iraq. And then as a Navy officer, I did logistics and supply, and I was a combat logistics officer in Singapore, so I basically arranged for material to go out on ships that was transferred at sea, underway replenishments, and I was a supply officer for a reserve SEAL team in Coronado, and that's interesting but not exciting because you're a supply guy, you're not doing any cool stuff. And then the last two jobs I had nothing to do with my job as far as the Navy is concerned. Being an investigator for the military commissions was the military using my civilian background, and then the final job was just because I had worked at a SEAL team, I had a higher security clearance, so they just needed someone with the right security clearance to do this job. They didn't need a supply officer. In fact, well, there was some budget oversight, but nothing that wasn't my main focus. So it was a very interesting, kind of broad, some would say unfocused career, but I enjoyed it.
From a military standpoint, is it easy to go from one service to another service? Is there hard? Is there
the enlistment part when I went? It becomes more difficult the older you are because everyone has some kind of physical brokenness. I didn't know you could transfer your commission, but if you do it as a 01 or an 02, that is a second lieutenant or an ensign, depending on what your job is and how much the military needs that job at that moment in time, you don't know until, if you're in a very high demand job, no, it's very difficult to do. But if you're a transportation officer, and the bottom line is transportation officers run truck companies, and we're a dime a dozen. There's a lot of us. So to go to the Navy was not a big deal. It's totally dependent on the needs of the service at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So even 6 months or a year later, somebody else in the exact same qualifications could have a more difficult time than you did, or an easier time.
And when you first started out, were your parents glad you joined, or were they not involved?
When I first joined, I had gone to junior college for a year and ran out of money, and there wasn't a lot of scholarships, and probably my scholarship wasn't as up to snuff as it could be. So enlisting in the military, because I'd been in a military youth program, the Naval Sea Cadets, which I volunteer with now. My father had been a soldier, but during World War II, he was drafted and did his time and got out and came back like so many other millions of guys did. And my mother's family, her brother had been in the Army, so there was no negativity involved. It was just something that I did, and the family supported it. Nobody took me aside and said, "What are you doing?" I first went in 1977, right on the tail end of Vietnam. So out in the world there was a lot of bad publicity or bad blood, but there was none in my family or the people that I floated around with. So it was the perfect match for a job that I was interested in with the law enforcement and what the military had, and I was able to pick where I went. I went to the Presidio of San Francisco, which is kind of looks like Anderson Island, but it's tucked away in the corner of San Francisco. It's a national park now, so that was an interesting place to just be 18 to 21, and then that dovetailed into me being able to, because I was stationed in the United States, I was able to look for a job. Last year I was in.
Well, I appreciate your service to the country, and we'll publish this and put it on YouTube.
It was my honor to do it.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you.